The morning sun cast long shadows across my backyard as I watched from my kitchen window. 30 people in formal attire were setting up chairs on my property. My property. Without my permission. The woman directing the chaos wore a pristine white dress and barked orders like a military general. Corinne Henderson, my HOA president, had finally crossed a line I never imagined anyone would dare cross. I gripped my coffee mug tighter as she pointed toward my prize-winning rose garden, instructing workers to move my furniture aside for her daughter's wedding reception. 3 months of harassment, fines, and legal threats had led to this moment. She actually believed she could steal my backyard for her personal use. But Corinne had no idea what was waiting in the pasture behind my barn. 42 curious, gentle giants who were about to teach her the most expensive lesson of her life. That morning, as I watched her transform my sanctuary into her personal venue, I made a decision that would change everything forever. 5 years ago, I bought these 5 acres of paradise to escape everything Corinne Henderson represented. The real estate agent called it a rustic property with unlimited potential. But I saw it as my salvation from 20 years of city life and the HOA nightmare I had left behind. My mornings began with coffee on the wraparound porch, watching my small herd of Highland cattle graze in the golden morning light. These gentle giants with their shaggy coats and calm dispositions had become more than livestock. They were my companions, each with distinct personalities and names. Magnus, the lead bull, would lumber over for scratches behind his massive horns. Bella and her calf Daisy stayed close to the fence, always curious about visitors. The property stretched from the main road back to a creek that bubbled through ancient oak trees. I had spent years building this sanctuary, a vegetable garden that produced more tomatoes and peppers than I could eat, a chicken coop that provided fresh eggs every morning, a barn that housed my tractor and tools, everything I needed to maintain my little slice of heaven. When I first moved here, the area was truly rural. My nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile away, and we waved when we passed on the narrow country road. The land was zoned agricultural, perfect for my small cattle operation and peaceful retirement from corporate consulting. Then the development began. Slowly at first, just a few houses scattered through the rolling hills. The developers promised to maintain the rural character, building homes that blended with the landscape. For the first 2 years, this promise held true. My new neighbors were like-minded people who had chosen country living for the same reasons I had. The HOA formed naturally, initially just a group of neighbors who wanted to maintain shared gravel roads and ensure everyone had adequate septic systems. We met once a quarter in someone's living room, discussing practical matters like snow removal and mailbox placement. It felt like a genuine community. Then Corinne Henderson moved in. Corinne arrived from a high-end subdivision in the city, where she had served as HOA president for 8 years. She bought the largest lot in our community and immediately began making her presence known. At her first HOA meeting, she arrived with a briefcase full of printed materials and suggestions for bringing our community up to modern standards. Her smile was perfectly practiced, but her eyes held the calculating gleam of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence and paperwork. She spoke in measured tones about property values and community aesthetics, nodding sympathetically when others expressed concerns about maintaining our rural character. Within 6 months, Corinne had been elected HOA president by promising to keep our community exclusive and well-maintained. Most of us voted for her because she seemed organized and dedicated. We had no idea we were handing over our freedom to someone who viewed rural living as a problem to be solved rather than a lifestyle to be preserved. The warning sign started small. Karen began driving through the neighborhood twice a week, taking photographs and notes. She called these community assessments and claimed they were necessary for maintaining property values. When I saw her photographing my barn from the road, I waved and invited her to come closer if she wanted to meet the cattle. Her response should have warned me what was coming. She smiled that practiced smile and said, "Oh, I am just documenting some concerns about agricultural odors and their impact on neighboring properties. Nothing personal, of course." Nothing personal. Those words would haunt our interactions for the next 3 years. Karen's transformation from friendly neighbor to bureaucratic tyrant happened gradually, then all at once. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail in an official HOA envelope. The subject: unsightly agricultural equipment visible from public roads. I stood in my driveway, reading the formal language that described my tractor as an eyesore that negatively impacts community aesthetics. The notice demanded I construct a storage building to hide my equipment within 30 days or face daily fines of $50. I had parked that tractor in the same spot for 5 years. It was a well-maintained John Deere that I used for mowing, hauling feed, and maintaining my property. Every other neighbor with acreage had similar equipment visible from the road. But Karen had decided to make an example of me. The phone calls started the next day. Karen's voice on my answering machine was sugar-sweet but firm. "I know this seems harsh, but we have to maintain standards. Property values depend on everyone doing their part." I called her back, hoping to find a reasonable compromise. Perhaps I could park the tractor behind the barn, out of view from the main road. But Karen was not interested in compromise. She had researched, she said, comparable communities with similar property values, best practices for rural HOAs, data showing how agricultural aesthetics affected home sales. "I understand you chose rural living," she said during our 20-minute phone conversation. "But this is not just about your preferences anymore. We have a community to consider." The second violation notice arrived 2 weeks later. This time, Karen cited livestock odors creating nuisance conditions. She had apparently hired an environmental consultant to measure air quality near my property line. The report, attached to her notice, contained graphs and technical language that made my cattle sound like an industrial pollution source. I consulted my own lawyer, a local attorney who specialized in agricultural law. He reviewed my property deed and local zoning regulations. "You are absolutely within your rights," he assured me. "Your land is zoned agricultural. You can keep livestock. The HOA cannot override county zoning laws." But Karen disagreed. Her next letter came with copies of HOA covenants that I had never seen before. Apparently, during the community's incorporation, she had pushed through amendments that gave the HOA authority over any activities that might impact community welfare. The language was vague enough to mean anything Karen wanted it to mean. The harassment became systematic. Karen began driving past my property every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, photographing any changes or potential violations. She measured my fence height with a surveyor's tape. She documented the exact location of my compost pile. She even took pictures of my chickens, claiming they constituted uncontrolled poultry, under a regulation I had never heard of. Other neighbors began calling me with their own stories. Jim Patterson received a violation for his vegetable garden being insufficiently maintained. Sarah Martinez got cited for her children's swing set being non-conforming playground equipment. Even elderly, Mrs. Chen received a notice about her bird feeders attracting excessive wildlife. The pattern became clear. Karen was targeting anyone who embraced rural living in ways that did not match her suburban vision. She wanted manicured lawns, hidden utilities, and activities that stayed behind closed doors. The irony was overwhelming. She had moved to the country but wanted to recreate the sterile subdivision she had left behind. The fines started accumulating. $50 per day for my visible agricultural equipment, $25 per day for odor violations, $15 per day for non-conforming landscaping because I preferred wildflowers to ornamental shrubs. I refused to pay the fines, and Karen escalated to legal threats. Her lawyer sent letters demanding immediate compliance and payment of accumulated penalties. The total reached nearly $2,000 within 2 months, for the crime of living peacefully on my own property the same way I had for years. But Karen's biggest mistake was thinking I would simply comply rather than fight back. She had never encountered someone who understood that bureaucratic bullying only works when people accept it. She had no idea that her systematic harassment was about to backfire in ways she could never imagine. The breaking point was coming, and when it arrived, Karen would learn that some battles are not worth starting. The call came on a Thursday evening in late September. I was feeding my cattle when my phone rang with Karen's number displayed on the screen. After 3 months of written violations and legal threats, she rarely called anymore. Her voice sounded different this time, less formal and more excited. "I hope you are having a good evening," she began with unusual warmth. "I wanted to discuss an opportunity that could benefit both of us." I remained silent, waiting for the trap I knew was coming. "My daughter Jessica is getting married next month, and we have been looking for the perfect venue. Your backyard is absolutely stunning, especially with those oak trees and the view toward the creek. We would love to use your property for the ceremony and reception." The audacity of her request left me speechless. For months, Karen had been harassing me about property maintenance, livestock odors, and community aesthetics. Now she wanted to use my problematic property for her daughter's wedding. "I am not interested in hosting events on my property," I said carefully. Karen's tone shifted immediately. "Well, let me explain the situation more clearly. This is not exactly a request. According to HOA Covenant Section 12.4, community properties can be designated for special events that benefit the neighborhood. Your backyard would be perfect for bringing our community together." I had never heard of Section 12.4, and I suspected Karen was making it up as she spoke. "This is my private property, Karen. I do not rent it out for events." "Oh, you misunderstand," she continued with that practiced laugh. "This would not be a rental situation. This would be your contribution to community welfare. Think of it as fulfilling your civic duty as an HOA member." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Karen alternating between fake enthusiasm and barely veiled threats. She had already spoken to other board members, she claimed. They were all excited about the community coming together for such a special occasion. My cooperation would show that I was finally ready to be a good neighbor. "What if I refuse?" I asked directly. Karen's voice turned cold. "Well, that would be unfortunate. We have been very patient with your ongoing violations, but if you continue to resist community involvement, we might need to pursue more serious enforcement measures. Legal action can be very expensive, as I am sure you understand." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a dial tone and rising anger. Karen had just attempted to extort the use of my private property by threatening me with trumped-up legal action. The next morning brought official confirmation. A certified letter arrived with HOA letterhead and formal language demanding my cooperation with Community Event Planning Initiative Number 1. The wedding was scheduled for October 15th. Setup would begin at 7 in the morning. The ceremony would start at 4 in the afternoon, followed by a reception lasting until 10 at night. The letter included a detailed plan for using my property. The ceremony would take place under my oak trees, with guests seated on my lawn. The reception would use my patio and deck, with catering tables arranged throughout my backyard. My vegetable garden would be temporarily relocated to make room for a dance floor. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller print, Karen had included the consequences of noncompliance. Immediate fines of $200 per day for obstruction of community activities, legal action to force compliance, and a lien against my property to collect accumulated penalties. I read the letter 3 times, my disbelief growing with each pass. Karen was actually trying to steal my backyard for her daughter's wedding by disguising theft as community service. That afternoon, I called my lawyer again. He listened to the situation with growing amazement. "This is completely illegal," he said bluntly. "No HOA has the authority to commandeer private property for personal events. She is essentially attempting theft through intimidation." But legal action would take months, and the wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Karen was counting on my inability to stop her through normal channels. She had calculated that most people would simply comply rather than fight an expensive legal battle over a single weekend. Karen had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed I would react like her previous victims, accepting her authority rather than fighting back. She had no idea that her ultimate violation was about to inspire the most creative and satisfying response of my entire life. That night, I sat on my porch and watched my cattle grazing peacefully in the moonlight. Magnus looked up from his evening meal and snorted softly, as if asking what was troubling me. I scratched his shaggy head and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Do not worry, old friend," I whispered. "We are going to solve this problem together." The morning after receiving Karen's wedding ultimatum, I began the most satisfying planning project of my life. But first, I needed intelligence. If Karen wanted to play games with my property, I would make sure I understood every rule she intended to break. I spent the weekend researching HOA law and property rights. My lawyer provided legal precedents showing that no homeowners association could force private property use for personal events. I documented every fraudulent claim in Karen's letters, building a case that would protect me from any legal retaliation. But legal protection was only the beginning. Karen had made this personal when she tried to steal my backyard, and I intended to respond in kind. My surveillance began subtly. Every morning, I watched from my kitchen window as Karen drove through the neighborhood on her inspection rounds. She had developed a routine, photographing properties and taking notes on a clipboard. Her dedication to documenting other people's lives was about to become very useful for my own documentation purposes. On Tuesday, I noticed unusual activity at Karen's house. A white van parked in her driveway with "Premier Wedding Planning" painted on the side. 2 women in business suits spent the morning walking around my property with Karen, pointing at my oak trees and measuring distances with a tape measure. They never knocked on my door. They never asked permission to walk on my land. Karen was showing wedding planners around my backyard as if she already owned it. I grabbed my camera and documented everything. Photos of the wedding planners on my property without permission, pictures of Karen pointing at my patio and deck, evidence of trespassing that would support my legal case if needed. But more importantly, I was learning the details of Corinne's wedding plan. The ceremony would be held under my largest oak tree, with 60 guests seated in rented chairs on my lawn. The reception would use my entire patio, with catering tables arranged throughout my backyard. A DJ would set up near my vegetable garden, and a portable dance floor would cover the area where I normally parked my tractor. Corinne's planning was meticulous, which made my counterplanning even more satisfying. She had chosen my property because of its natural beauty and peaceful setting. The rolling pasture behind my house provided a perfect backdrop for wedding photos. The mature oak trees created natural shade for the ceremony. My well-maintained lawn offered space for guests to mingle during the reception. Everything Corinne loved about my property for her wedding was about to work against her in ways she could never imagine. My cattle normally grazed in the pasture behind my house, separated from my backyard by a wooden fence I had built when I first moved in. The fence was sturdy but not decorative, designed to keep livestock contained rather than impress neighbors. It consisted of wooden posts and rails with a simple gate that I used to move the cattle between pastures. The key to my plan was that gate. It was secured with a chain and padlock, but it could be opened quickly when needed. The cattle were accustomed to moving between pastures, and they trusted me to guide them to fresh grass and water. Highland cattle are naturally curious animals. They investigate anything new in their environment, approaching with cautious interest rather than fear or aggression. Magnus, my lead bull, weighed nearly 2,000 pounds but had the temperament of a large dog. He loved attention from visitors and would gently approach anyone who stood near the fence. The rest of my herd followed his lead. Bella and Daisy, my mother-daughter pair, were especially social and enjoyed human interaction. The younger bulls, Hamish and Duncan, were playful and energetic, always eager to explore new areas of the property. During the week before the wedding, I began preparing my allies for their starring role. I moved the cattle to the far pasture, away from my house, to create the illusion that they would not be a factor during Corinne's event. I repaired any weak spots in the fencing and ensured the gate mechanism was working smoothly. Most importantly, I practiced the timing. Corinne's wedding was scheduled to begin at 4 in the afternoon, with the reception starting around 6. The optimal moment for my intervention would be during the ceremony itself, when all the guests were seated and focused on the proceedings. I also prepared my legal defense. My lawyer helped me document every aspect of Corinne's illegal property seizure. We had photographs of her trespassing, copies of her fraudulent HOA demands, and evidence of her threats and intimidation. If Corinne tried to claim I had deliberately sabotaged her wedding, I had proof that she had no right to use my property in the first place. The moral justification was clear in my mind. Corinne had spent months harassing me with false violations and illegal demands. She had tried to steal my property through bureaucratic intimidation. She had trespassed on my land and planned an event without my consent. My response would not damage her property or harm any person. It would simply remind everyone present that this was my land, not Corinne's personal venue. The consequences would be embarrassing but not dangerous, educational but not destructive. As the wedding date approached, I felt a calm satisfaction I had not experienced in months. Corinne had pushed me past the point of passive resistance, and I was finally ready to push back. She wanted to use my beautiful property for her special day, and I was going to make sure she got exactly what she deserved. October 15th dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for an outdoor wedding. I woke early and watched from my bedroom window as the first catering trucks arrived at 6 in the morning. Corinne had hired a full-service wedding company that began transforming my backyard into an elegant reception venue without bothering to knock on my front door. I made coffee and settled onto my porch to observe the preparations. White folding chairs appeared in neat rows under my oak tree. A wooden arch decorated with flowers was positioned for the ceremony. Catering tables were arranged on my patio, covered with crisp white linens and sparkling glassware. The workers moved with professional efficiency, clearly accustomed to setting up outdoor events. They knew nothing about the property dispute or Karen's illegal seizure of my land. They were simply doing their jobs, following instructions from a client who had presumably paid for venue access. Karen appeared around 9 o'clock, directing the setup with military precision. She wore a flowing dress in mother-of-the-bride blue and carried a clipboard filled with detailed schedules and instructions. Her excitement was obvious as she pointed to various locations and explained her vision for the perfect wedding. I remained on my porch, drinking coffee and reading a book. Several workers glanced in my direction, but Karen had apparently instructed them to ignore me. She wanted to maintain the illusion that she had legitimate authority over my property until it was too late for me to stop her. By noon, the transformation was complete. My rustic backyard had become an elegant wedding venue that could have graced the pages of a bridal magazine. The contrast between Karen's suburban aesthetic and my rural property created exactly the picturesque setting she had envisioned for her daughter's special day. The irony was not lost on me. For months, Karen had complained about my property's agricultural character and rural appearance. Now she was using those same qualities to create the perfect backdrop for her family celebration. The wedding party arrived at 2 o'clock for photographs. The bride was genuinely beautiful in a flowing white gown, and I felt a momentary pang of guilt about what was coming. This was her wedding day, a moment she would remember for the rest of her life, and I was about to turn it into an unforgettable disaster. But my sympathy was tempered by anger at Karen's behavior. She had created this situation by stealing my property and ignoring my rights. The consequences were her responsibility, not mine. Guests began arriving at 3:30, parking along the road and walking across my front yard to reach the backyard ceremony site. I recognized several neighbors who had also suffered under Karen's HOA harassment. They looked uncomfortable but compliant, probably afraid to refuse Karen's invitation. At 3:45, I walked to my barn and quietly opened the gate between my cattle pasture and backyard. Then I returned to my porch to wait for the perfect moment. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock sharp. The officiant, a local minister who clearly had no idea about the property dispute, welcomed guests to this beautiful setting provided by the generosity of our community. Karen beamed with satisfaction as her daughter walked down the makeshift aisle toward her waiting groom. I waited until the minister reached the most solemn part of the ceremony. "Do you, Jessica, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The bride was about to respond when I gave a soft whistle toward the pasture. Magnus, my lead bull, had been watching the activity with typical Highland cattle curiosity. At my signal, he began ambling toward the open gate, followed by the rest of the herd. 42 cattle weighing between 800 and 2,000 pounds, each began their slow, peaceful migration toward the wedding ceremony. Highland cattle move with deliberate majesty rather than urgency. They do not stampede or charge, but rather flow across the landscape like a slow-moving river of shaggy hair and curved horns. Their approach was gradual enough that the first guests noticed them before they became a serious disruption. "Oh my goodness," someone whispered loudly, "are those cows?" The bride turned to see what had captured the attention of her wedding guests. Her eyes widened as she spotted Magnus approaching the ceremony site with calm determination. Behind him, Bella and Daisy followed with their distinctive Highland cattle swagger, completely unbothered by the crowd of formally dressed humans. "What are those animals doing here?" Karen's voice cut through the murmur of surprised guests. She stood at the front of the ceremony area, her face transitioning from confusion to horror as she realized what was happening. The minister tried to maintain his composure. "Perhaps we should continue with the ceremony," he suggested, raising his voice slightly as more cattle emerged from the pasture. But Highland cattle are naturally social animals, and the gathering of humans had triggered their curiosity. The younger bulls, Hamish and Duncan, picked up their pace and began approaching the wedding guests with friendly interest. Several people in the back rows stood up for a better view, unsure whether to be alarmed or amused. "Somebody stop them," Karen shouted, abandoning all pretense of wedding elegance. She began waving her arms at the approaching cattle, apparently believing she could shoo away 2,000-pound animals through sheer force of personality. Magnus, being an intelligent animal, interpreted Karen's arm waving as an invitation to approach. He ambled directly toward her with his massive head lowered in friendly greeting. Karen stumbled backward, tripped over a flower arrangement, and landed in an undignified heap on my lawn. The wedding guests' reactions varied dramatically. The children were delighted, pointing and laughing at the unexpected animal visitors. Several teenagers began taking selfies with the cattle in the background. But the older guests were less enthusiastic, gathering their purses and backing toward the safety of their cars. "This is sabotage," Corinne screamed from the ground, her perfect mother-of-the-bride dress now stained with grass and mud. "Someone call the police. This is deliberate destruction of private property." I remained on my porch, sipping coffee and watching the chaos unfold with deep satisfaction. When Corinne spotted me, her face turned purple with rage. "You did this on purpose," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. I set down my coffee cup and walked to the edge of my porch. "I am sorry about the disruption," I called out in my most concerned voice. "Sometimes the gate latch does not hold properly. These old fences can be unreliable." Within minutes of the cattle's arrival, Corinne's elegant wedding had dissolved into complete chaos. The Highland cattle, perfectly content to graze on my lawn, were oblivious to the human drama surrounding them. Magnus had discovered the catering table and was investigating a tray of hors d'oeuvres with scientific interest, while Bella and her calf explored the flower arrangements with gentle curiosity. Most of the wedding guests evacuated to their cars, though a few brave souls remained to help the bride gather her dress and move to safety. The photographer, demonstrating admirable professionalism, continued taking pictures of what had become the most unique wedding documentation of his career. Corinne struggled to her feet, her blue dress torn and stained, her carefully styled hair disheveled from her encounter with my lawn. Her face was a mask of pure fury as she marched toward my porch with the determination of a general leading a charge. "You planned this," she screamed, pointing at the cattle peacefully grazing around her daughter's wedding ceremony. "This is intentional sabotage, and I am going to have you arrested." I remained calm, speaking in the measured tone I had perfected during months of Corinne's harassment. "I am truly sorry about the disruption to your daughter's wedding. However, I should point out that you never asked permission to use my property for this event." "Permission?" Corinne's voice rose to a pitch that made several cattle look up with interest. "I do not need permission. This is a community event authorized by the HOA." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the legal research I had prepared. No HOA has the authority to commandeer private property for personal events. What you have done here is called trespassing, and it is illegal. Corinne's fury was magnificent in its irrationality. You cannot prove I did this on purpose. Those cows could have escaped accidentally. You are absolutely right, I agreed with exaggerated reasonableness. Cattle gates sometimes fail, especially old ones like mine. It is unfortunate that it happened during your unauthorized use of my property, but these things occur on working farms. The bride, who had been crying quietly near the catering table, finally spoke up. "Mom, can we please just move the ceremony somewhere else? This is supposed to be my wedding day, not a legal battle." But Corinne was beyond reason. The months of planning, the expense of the catering and flowers, the embarrassment in front of family and friends, had combined into a perfect storm of wounded pride and thwarted control. "I know my rights," she declared, though her legal knowledge was clearly limited to intimidation tactics that had worked on previous victims. "You are going to pay for this. I will sue you for property damage, emotional distress, and interference with a legal contract." Several neighbors who had been forced to attend the wedding were watching our confrontation with undisguised interest. Jim Patterson, who had suffered his own harassment from Corinne, was openly smiling. Sarah Martinez was recording the scene on her phone, apparently recognizing its historical significance for our community. "Corinne," I said gently, "you should probably focus on relocating your daughter's wedding rather than making legal threats you cannot support. There are several lovely venues in town that actually rent space for events." The reality of her situation was finally beginning to penetrate Corinne's rage. She looked around at the scattered wedding guests, the cattle contentedly munching on expensive floral arrangements, and her daughter's tear-streaked face. The perfect day she had planned through months of illegal property seizure had become a rural comedy that would be remembered for years. "This is not over," she hissed, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "You have not heard the last of this." As Corinne gathered the remnants of her wedding party and began the humiliating process of relocating her daughter's ceremony, I noticed something important. The other neighbors were no longer looking at her with fear or compliance. They were looking at her with the dawning realization that her authority was built on intimidation rather than law. For the first time in months, Corinne Henderson looked like what she actually was: a bully who had finally encountered someone willing to push back. The aftermath of Corinne's wedding disaster rippled through our small community like stones thrown into a quiet pond. Within a week of the cattle incident, 3 different neighbors called to thank me for standing up to Corinne's bullying. Jim Patterson said he had never laughed so hard in his life, and Sarah Martinez shared her video of the event with friends across the county. But the real changes went deeper than neighborhood entertainment. Corinne's attempted property seizure had finally revealed the true extent of her illegal HOA overreach, and our community was ready to respond. 2 weeks after the wedding, I received a call from Tom Bradley, one of the original HOA founders who had been quietly horrified by Corinne's transformation of our simple community organization into a bureaucratic weapon. He was organizing a special meeting to review Corinne's presidency and all the violations she had issued over the past year. "We never intended the HOA to become a tool for personal harassment," Tom explained. "Most of us moved here to escape exactly this kind of neighborhood tyranny." The meeting was held at the community center, and nearly every homeowner attended. Corinne arrived with her briefcase full of regulations and precedents, clearly prepared to defend her actions with legal terminology and intimidation tactics. But the mood in the room was different from previous meetings. People were no longer afraid of her. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories of Corinne's harassment. The accumulated evidence was overwhelming. Fraudulent violations, illegal fines, property inspections without permission, and threats of legal action for normal rural activities. When my turn came, I simply stated the facts. Corinne had attempted to steal my property for her personal use by claiming false HOA authority. When I refused to comply, she had trespassed on my land and held an unauthorized event. The cattle incident was an unfortunate accident that occurred during her illegal use of my property. Corinne's defense was predictably aggressive. She accused me of deliberately sabotaging her daughter's wedding and claimed that my cattle had destroyed thousands of dollars worth of decorations and catering. But when pressed for evidence, she could not explain how she had the authority to use my property without permission. The vote was unanimous. Corinne Henderson was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. All the violations and fines she had issued were declared invalid and rescinded. The HOA bylaws were amended to prevent future abuse of authority. Corinne left the meeting in fury, threatening legal action against the entire community. But her threats were empty, and everyone knew it. She had no legal basis for her actions, and her behavior had been thoroughly documented by multiple witnesses. Within 6 months, Corinne put her house on the market and moved back to the city. The "For Sale" sign in her yard became a symbol of victory for everyone who had suffered under her reign of bureaucratic terror. Our community returned to its original character. Neighbors helping neighbors, reasonable people solving problems through conversation rather than violation notices, and rural property owners free to live peacefully on their own land. My cattle continue to graze contentedly in their pasture, occasionally looking toward the fence where Corinne's wedding once stood. Magnus still approaches visitors with friendly curiosity, completely unaware that he played a starring role in the most satisfying moment of rural justice our community has ever witnessed. Sometimes the best response to a bully is not legal action or angry confrontation, but simply letting them face the natural consequences of their own unreasonable behavior. Corinne wanted to use my beautiful property for her special day, and she got exactly what she deserved. An unforgettable lesson in property rights delivered by 42 Highland cattle with impeccable timing.